Hello everyone and welcome to the binding system tutorial. This will be the first tutorial in a series of tutorials. Before we dive in, a quick note on binding system. This system allows you to link data from one object to data of another object. Think of it as a wire connecting these two data points and exchanging data directly. Okay, this is what we will get by the end of this tutorial. Here we have a UI with the health bar and the number of coins. Once I press play, we can see the policeman here, which can go right and left. We have some columns here shooting arrows and coins, which can be collected by the policeman. Now, once the policeman gets hit by an arrow, you can see the health bar reducing, and as well the light is getting dimmer and dimmer, and the policeman can collect the coins. So this is a very simple example which we will cover in all details. Okay, now time to roll back and start fresh. Okay, now we will start by binding the health bar. So let me go through the hierarchy and let you know what these objects are. So we have the typical like cameras and lights and so on, and then we have the game manager. So the game manager has the health value, which is current health, and then it has the max value and the coin counter. So now we need to go to the health part. So here we have the user interface, UI, we go to panel, health, and we have the value, which consists of the main value, where it has the background, health fill, and health text. So we have the background, which is the color green. This is the one we need. And now what I have to do is to bind the fill amount of this component. Why the fill amount? Because if I change its value, you can see it changes the green bar. So this is what we need. And now, in order to bind any type of field in the inspector, what you need to do is right-click on fill amount, and then you can see we have two comments here, additional comments, and I will explain the first one, and then later in other tutorials I will explain the second one. The first one is enable binding, and once I enable it, there is a small hexagon there, and this means that this field can be bound. Right now it's not bound yet because I can change its value and it has its direct value as before. And if I want to bind it, what I need to do is to click on this hexagon, and once I click on it, you can see the UI changes, and here we have a bunch of other buttons, and I will go very deeply with for each button and explain what it does. The first thing to notice is there is a message nothing selected. This means that this field is bound to nothing for now, so it won't work by default. What we need to do right now is to get the game manager and drag it over this field, and you can see there is a change source. And there is a tooltip as well, stating that you need to drag and drop an object to bind it to this field. And once I drop it, you can see there is this menu, and I call this menu the bind path menu. Why the bind path? Because there is another menu which is called the bind menu. Okay, and now I can see there is the game manager, which is the game object, and it has two components, transform and game manager. Okay, and then there is the pin part, which is we are not interested right now, and I will explain it in next tutorials. Now I should go to game manager script, and here I can see all the properties that I can bind to the fill amount field, and in this case I will bind health. Okay, great. So now you see that the fill amount is bound to health value, let's say health field of the game manager. To see which object this field is bound to, either I can expand this and I can see it's bound from the game manager, and if I click you can see the ping there, or if I hide it, so this is a toggle, I can show and hide it, or if I hold Control or Command, Control Windows or Command on macOS, I can click on it, holding that button, and it will ping directly the object. Okay, and now if I hit play and I move the policeman, you can see once I get hit, nothing changes. Why nothing changes? Because we forgot one important thing, which is the fill amount is, let me go to global, the game manager. The health value is going from 0 to 100, or maybe the other way around, from 100 to 0. Meanwhile, the fill amount value is normalized, meaning it goes from 0 to 1. So there is a problem here. Okay, and what we do to fix this problem? Well, the system allows you to add modifiers. So a modifier is basically a building block which modifies the value before it gets to the bound field. So let me start from the beginning of all this UI, so you can get like a better understanding what happens here. Okay, so we have the fill amount field of this component, which is bound to the health field of the game manager object. And there is an arrow. This arrow is very important because it means that the value flows from the health field of the game manager to the fill amount field of the image component. Now I can change this direction, for example, so going from the fill amount to the health, or having it both ways. This means that the health is first written to the fill amount, and once the update, for example, method is completed, the fill amount will be written back to the health value. By default, it is in this way. This means it reads from, okay, and I call this button bind mode. Then we have here the preview, so I can preview the value directly. As you can see, the health is 100. I can change it here, for example, to make it like 90, okay? And if I go back, you can see here it's 90. So I can see directly the value of the target bind path, let's say. Okay, let me put it back to 100. Now, let me hide this. And one more thing we have here, actually two more things, is the field type. So here I need a float type, so the fill amount is a float type. And then I have this small button here. So this is what we need right now. This is the bind menu that I mentioned previously. And if I click here, we have all the configuration for this bound field. We can start with the update points. By default, bound field has its update point enabled to update. This means that the value is updated before the update method. Let's say, so these points are basically injection points in the player loop in Unity. We have all these points, these are all the stages in the player loop pipeline. And we have the update by default. This means if you hover, you see the tooltip. This means that the reads happen before the update, and the writes happen after the update. Okay, and this is the same for the late update, the render, and the fixed update. However, it's important to know that the writes happen if we have the both ways bind mode enabled. Otherwise, it will happen before the update, similar to the read one. Then we have the editor part. This is useful when you need, for example, to see the values, let's say the bind working directly in the editor mode, so without going to play mode. And then we have on change. This is pretty interesting point. It actually updates the field only when the target or the source field or property changes. So in this case, when only half changes. And then we have on enable. This means that the data is updated only when the game object, not the component itself, but the game object half fill will be enabled, activated, or deactivated. Then we have optimized update. This means that the value will be updated only during update stage, and only if it's enabled only if the in this case the game manager's half is changed and the game manager is active. And then you have the option to change how often the value is updated, and by default it's for every frame, but you can change it to, I don't know, like every 5 frames in this case, or every 5 seconds, for example, or every second. It depends. By default, it's every frame, okay? And we'll leave it right now. I like this right now. Then we have live update, reroute, which will be explained better in next tutorials. Then reset values, it basically resets all this binding UI and all the stuff. And then we have the modifiers. Now it's important to know that every type, so in this case floating type, floating number type, has their own modifiers. So in this case we see the modifiers for the floating type. And what we need in this case is value normalization. And if I click this one, so I've added this modifier, okay, and I can add more modifiers if I want. So for example, I then want to, I don't know, maybe clamp the value, okay. So what happens here is the value, half value is normalized between 0 and 1. So in this case, we have to set 100, for example, and then it will be the value coming from this normalization will be clamped between 0 and 1. I can as well change the order of the modifiers, and the order is very important. But in this case, I will just remove it because we need only the normalization. Okay, and now if we go into play mode, and I move my policeman, you can see that the value changes because we have normalized it correctly between 0 and 100. And it will output a value between 0 and 1, which is suitable for the fill amount. Okay, and now let's stop it. And then there's the question. Okay, so what happens, for example, if I go into Game Manager and I change my max value to go not from 100 to 0, but for example from 130 to 0. Okay, in this case, what we can do is we go back to health fill, and you can see we have this hexagon here as well. So anywhere you see a hexagon, this means that the value can be bound. In this case, I can bound the max value, okay, and I have the bind mode as set to read by default, and it cannot be changed because the the modifier doesn't allow to change the bind mode. And here I can grab again the game manager and set it here, for example. But what okay, so let me grab it and place it here. And here I can bind it to max value. Okay. And now let me show you what happens if I don't bind it. So this is not bound, so it goes from 0 to 100, and you can see the max health value is 130. This should start the health from this value. And now, once I get hit the first 3 times, I don't see any changes here. Okay. Yeah, and this is a problem. And now, if I go here and enable the binding, so you can see the binding has kept its value, previous value, bound value. And now, if I go here, look, you see, it changes. Now, I can test it even in runtime. So I can go like 200, and you can see it's halfway through. Okay, great. So now we have the health bar, and we've covered the basic binding and adding a modifier, which is pretty cool. Now let's go to the coins part, because we will see another thing, another important part of the binding system. So we select the coin, and we have the X label, which is just the letter X, and then we have the coins amount, and currently it's set to 0, and I can set to 5 or any other value. Let's set it to 0, and if I go into play mode and I try to collect a coin, nothing happens here. It's still 0. This means that we should bind this value, let's say this field, to Game Manager's coin count field. Now I select this text mesh pro, and you don't see it, but there's the field called text here, which is hidden by the text mesh pro editor. And if I right click here, you can see I can enable the binding as well here. And if I enable it and turn it on, you see we have text and I can bind it. And now if I drag and drop the game manager and I go to the game manager script, by the way, if for example there are the components themselves or the game object can be bound to a field, you can see that I can select already the component, or I can navigate inside the component, so in this case script or the transform or game object, and select a different value. Okay, and here I can select the coin count. By the way, this is an integer, right? And I can see here this symbol, this icon. This icon means that the value uses conversion. And this is another important aspect of the binding system. So I can bind an integer to a string, right? So here's the important stuff. Here you can see, if I enable or disable this, I have a converter. So this converter, if I hover here, it's convert on read, so it reads from the coin count, from the game manager, so it's an integer, and applies this conversion, and then the result of this conversion is applied to the text field. And now, if I leave it here empty because I don't have any formatting to do, and if I go into play mode here, pay attention what happens. If I collect a coin, you can see the value changes here. Okay. Now I can do many more things. For example, here, if I go into bind menu, I see there are different modifiers, for example, and I can add a string format. Now, this format is different from this format, and it's important to know the difference. So this format is applied to the value itself. So for example, if I would have like a floating number here, I could place like the formatting to 0.00, meaning that my float will be formatted to only 2 decimals. However, this format is different because if this is my placeholder, so this is 0 between brackets, and now I can write any text here. So for example, coins, for example, or let's say only CCs, right? And if I play here, you can see that I will have CC here. All right. Yeah, we cannot see the value here, but if I select, for example, this one, and let me move it here, for example, you see it changes, and I have formatting here done. So this is pretty powerful because you can have like very different and powerful strings with dynamic data with them. Okay. Now we have seen the conversions as well, and the converters are really powerful. And then we can have read converters, but there are write converters as well. And also, maybe I will show it later, but there is an option to select different converters if you have multiple converters for the same types. Now, once we've seen the binding, like the basics of the bindings, you may ask, okay, now we have bound the UI, for example, to some data. That's interesting, but is it only for the UI? Well, the answer is no. Actually, the binding system is pretty dynamic, and it adapts to many different types and fields and objects and so on. So you can use it for different bindings. For example, it may be useful. In the beginning, I showed you that the light is getting dimmer when the policeman gets hit more and more. So in this case, you can select, for example, the sunlight here, and I can bind the bind color, the light color here. I can bind it. So here I drag the game manager. Again, I select the health, for example. And you can see there is another conversion as well, and this is a numeric to color converter. So what happens here is that the health is fetched from the game manager, and then it's multiplied by this color. But before it's multiplied by this color, it has to be normalized, because as you know, the colors typically go from the color channels go from 0 to 1. So in this case, I need to normalize it to the game manager. So how can I bind it? Well, as before, by dragging and dropping, or I can click here and I see already the last used one. And I select the game manager and the max health here. So now, what color I should multiply it to? I don't know, maybe like we can multiply it to red, for example. And now watch what happens. It's completely red, and let me get hit like a lot of times. You will see it will slowly get black, darker and darker. See? Okay. Okay, so this is it for the first tutorial. I hope you liked it, and leave some comments below. I will try to answer them. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me by email. Most importantly, please check the tutorials and the documentation. Thank you everyone, and see you in the next tutorial.